Have you ever found yourself in a totally unexpected place? All of a sudden.
I have. When I was in seminary, after the end of my second year in 1991, Professor Mark Heim, who worships here with his wife Melissa from time to time, had built a relationship with the United Church of South India. And so there was this seminary called United Theological College. Being a candidate for ministry, I thought I should see how the rest of the world lives. So I'd been there 2 weeks, and things weren't going well. Culture shock was really starting to hit. There was a strike. They have a lot of strikes in India at the school, and things hadn't started. I hadn't made many friends, so I was feeling alone. And I'd realized how much I'd fallen in love with my now wife, Cindy. We'd only been together a couple of months, and we were 10,000 miles apart. I didn't understand the local language. It was vowel-based. I couldn't even count to 10, and I'm pretty good with language. So I was starting to get frustrated. There were all sorts of problems to solve every day, and I didn't understand. And so when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. And I went to the market for some retail therapy. Only to find out by one thing, a number of things, but one thing in particular, and I go outside and I show it to some people on the street. I'm so happy, introduce myself. And then they start shaking their heads and they said, "Oh, Mr. Dave, you got ripped off. You paid entirely too much money. You have to negotiate. You have to bargain." It showed me how. And so, confident in my newfound skill, I went back. And it happened again. It happened when I saw the same item 2 doors down for a much cheaper price. And just it all hit at once, and just the frustration and tears, and it was very overwhelming. And I felt really alone. And then it happened. I turned around, dejected, defeated, to go back to seminary. And there was my burning bush. A pink sandstone church. It was a Catholic church, and it was Saturday at 5 o'clock. Mass. People were coming to church. And I'd been to Catholic church with some of my friends over the years, and so I went in. And we stood up, and they read from the Bible. Okay, it's the gospel. I'm hearing the gospel. And then I heard a prayer in the cadence. It's the Lord's Prayer. We prayed the Lord's Prayer together in different languages. And then, okay, after the preaching, there was the creed. And I knew the creed, so we said it together. And then we sang Amazing Grace, even though we didn't understand one another. It was marvelous. It was a surreal experience. God saw their suffering. So from God was a surreal experience. Clip, clip, clip. So, the same thing happened to Moses. A surreal experience. He'd been in Midian for about 40 years as a shepherd, married the local high priest's daughter, lived a long life, but his body was starting to get old and creaky and probably getting more tired. And maybe he chased a lamb up onto the mountainside, and there he finally sees it. This bush that's not consumed by flames. And it's such a wonderful symbol in the story. These thorny bushes, this thorny bush was a symbol of his stubbornness over the years. Symbol perhaps of Israel's stubbornness, because as the story continues, they are going to be released after all the struggle from Pharaoh through the Red Sea, get to the other side, and what do? They complain. They complain about not having enough food or water or clothes. It was so much nicer back in Egypt. And there's snakes, Moses. There's snakes. The Church of Jesus Christ is threatened today. It seems like sometimes from all sides we need to adapt so much and we're not sure if we can keep up. It's threatening. Well, this burning bush symbol is a wonderful reassurance that God will abide by us, will be faithful to us, and not let us be consumed. God then speaks back to Moses, 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 and he realizes that this image is an angel speaking to him in a form that he could barely understand. Because Moses, remove your shoes, for the ground you're standing at, it's holy ground. And so Moses does it, and it's not only out of respect. God's calling him into relationship. When you remove your shoes, then you start to feel more in the moment, in the experience. You feel the dirt and the sand between your toes, maybe the heat of the flames coming off the bush, the vibrations of that sound of the flames and God's voice. And God calls him into a relationship, tells him he understands what's been happening to the Hebrews back in Israel, that he's going to deliver them, not only have mercy and compassion, but deliver them, sees what Egypt has been doing to them so harshly and oppressively. God's promising justice. And he says, I want you to go face Pharaoh and get out. And I'll lead you to the promised land, flowing in milk and honey. And even though Moses said, here I am to God, when he hears this, what he says back is, you want me to do what? You want me to go to Pharaoh? Who am I to do that? And then Moses kind of echoes his here I am and says, I will be with you. And Moses is concerned. And he says, but I go and tell this to the people. They're going to say, hey, Moses, son of Pharaoh, what name of God? What's the name of your God? What do I tell them? And God says, I am who I am. Tell them that I am has sent you to them. Wonderful story. And God promises. There's this wonderful play on here I am. Moses saying in response to the call of his name, here I am. God's promise to Moses' resistance saying, I will be with you. A future sense of here I am. And then at the very end, another echo. I am. You know, interim ministry is a lot like this experience of Moses. It can be surreal and unexpected. It can be a very different time, and yet it can also be a good time. It can be a time of experiencing holy ground, of God's promises that I will go with you through the valley of the shadow of death, and you will fear no evil. Remember, I'm the God who was before you, who was with you all those times before First Baptist Church, and meets us and saying, I'm here. And often, you know, we don't know when God is going to surprise us next. But interim ministry can be a wonderful, even weird, surreal experience of God's love. When I was in India, I was feeling all dejected and hurting and grieving, alone in the market. I didn't know the wonderful, powerful experience of church God was about to bring me into. I was on unexpected holy ground. And honestly, that day, I'd been quite stubborn. Interim ministry is often experienced to be one thing, and it winds up being quite another. In the past, the interim minister was the one who came, held down the fort, keeping the status quo until the real deal arrived. But friends, the world changes so fast now, and things are so volatile that we no longer have the luxury of keeping things in the status quo. It's not just an interim minister that's arrived, it's interim ministry that we engage in together, and it is the real deal. Different, unexpected, likely weirdly and wonderfully surreal. This is holy ground right now. It's a time of specific and extremely important ministries that we engage with God and with one another. It's holy ground, and it's time, perhaps I invite you, to remove our shoes and experience this new relationship with one another and with God on this holy ground, this holy season, right now, to say, here I am, God. And God says, I'm here. Don't fear. I'll be with you. I am. You know, I admired Pastor Joe's ministries for a long time, for over 20 years of amazing intercultural ministry that he had. But one of the reasons that Pastor Joe's ministry was so successful here is because you had an excellent interim minister before him, the Reverend Erica Wimber Avina. And she came in a very traumatic time of grief and loss after the death of Pastor Rick. And by the way, I knew Rick very well. I know Erica very well. And you traveled with Pastor Erica through the wilderness for a longer time than usual, but needed for 4 years of transition. And some very important ministry happened in that time where you discerned your calling so that you could hear Pastor Joe's calling, and he came, and you had 8 very successful and wonderful, if challenging, but wonderful years. So what's it like to present ourselves to this season of holy ground of interim ministry? Well, for one thing, for the first 3 months, what I'm going to mainly do, there might be some other things that we need to address, but the main thing is I need to listen to you, get to know you. Why are you here? What's happened? What do you wrestle with? What do you celebrate? Need to be here with your journey and to see God's presence moving in your lives. But in the middle of that time, you know, there's also a time where we're saying, here I am, to loss and grief. This pandemic is overwhelming. There's over 400,000 in the United States who have died, 2 million worldwide, and now it's even more contagious. There's been and is traumatic political upheaval in our nation that's disturbing and frightening. It's a time like no other that any of us has experienced in our lives. You lost your wonderful Pastor Joe. It's a loss. And even though you knew that his retirement was coming, it's still a loss to lose your pastor, especially right now. And you lost one of your most dearly loved members and leaders in Jennifer Johnson, who I also knew. I remember when she became the second female president of ABCON. Erica was the first. And she had a marvelous, strong, compassionate, loving, collaborating way about her. That first meeting of the board with ABCON was at my church in Essex, and that's the first time I met her. So this is a time in these months, initial months, when we say to God, in the midst of all this trauma and loss and grief, and say, God, I'm here, and I have hurts and pains. I'm surprised. I'm maybe a little angry. I don't know what's going to come next, but we need to let God come and minister to our hearts and say, I'm with you. I'm here. And then we're going to be present too and say, I'm here, history. We're going to come to terms with your history as First Baptist Church. Go back and look at it. Put up a timeline and see it, the past and also the present. Where is First Baptist Church right now? This step of coming to terms with history of the church is the most important step, because if you don't know where you've been and where you are, chances are First Baptist isn't going to make the right decisions to go into the future. It is an extremely important step, maybe more so important than all the others combined, to honestly own the past and the present so we can choose who we are and go into the future. Here am I. And then once we're present to that, we're going to be present to another thing. We're going to say, here I am. What is our purpose as First Baptist? What is our identity? We're wonderfully different. You're wonderfully different than you were 10 years ago. And it's important to take stock of what your purpose and identity are, because they may be different than what you think. There's so many new people, new circumstances, new ministries, and we need to listen to one another very carefully, including those we might not always hear from. And during the pandemic, it's exponentially harder. So much has happened in the past year, and we've been very focused on what do we need to do, what do we need to do, what do we need to do, what do we need to do. And one of the things is we need to be present and calm and tell each other stories about when First Baptist has been at our absolute best, and figure out what's the DNA that makes us the wonderful church that we are. Not that we want to repeat the past, but how is it that we want to take those wonderful qualities into the future? And maybe there'll be one or two items, parts of the DNA that maybe you want to set aside this time. Who are we? Our identity. And then ask God, what's our vision for the future? Who are you calling us to be? Purpose and identity. Here I am. And then in this interim season, there's also changes in leadership. And so one of the goals here, the functions, is that I'm going to be helping you with transitions in leadership. It's very natural. There are people that will say, I've been doing this a long time. I need a change, or I'd like to do something different, or I just need to stop and rest for a while. I need to be done now and just be here. And that's part of my ministry with you, to support, to train, develop new leaders through change. And so we need to be present to that. And we'll also say, here I am, to our new friends in the wider community. And you have many community connections, but it's a time of building connections, saying hello to those we're in wider ministry with. And you have such wonderful connections with AbCon, Joe being on staff, and so many AbCon clergy, ABC USA clergy, professors here. It's not going to be all that hard, but it's also a time to just reestablish and express our appreciation for them. And who knows, even though those relationships are fairly strong, there might be something new that God has in store for all of us. And finally, we'll say, here I am, to God in one more way. Having been present to all these, we'll focus on God's vision for the future. And we'll ask an extremely important question that needs time and attention, a really important question. God, looking at our past and our present and who we are, and what do you want us to do? And be really sincere about that, and open up the possibilities. And maybe there's something bold, as if you're not doing something bold already. That maybe there's something wonderful that new that God wants you to do. And once you do that, you'll embrace new leadership, call them, and move forward in ministry together. The roaring flames and raging waves of life threaten the Church of Jesus Christ today. They threatened the Hebrews. They threatened the early church. But God promises that we will not be consumed, that God is present and here. Look at that. We're standing on holy ground, the real deal, right now. Come, take off your shoes. Experience this new relationship with God. Unexpected, strange, wonderful ministry that we share together. And hopefully we will hear God's voice saying, "Here I am."